Good morning, everyone. My name is Sasaki. I'm from JP CERT Coordination Center. I would like to talk about the first step of active cyber defense, the significance of profiling attackers. I'm very humbled that my slides have been accepted by the juries, but it's been my honor to speak in front of you. First, before I start the slides, I would like to explain the backdrops. As you know, the Japanese government have been revising the 3 national security documents, and as a part of it, the active cyber defense is the concept that has been released. As you know, we are still drafting the strategies, so the details of the strategies will be finalized as we go on. However, the concept includes some outstanding ones, so I would like to know whether the counterattacks will be included or not, or any other themes that requires clear definitions are still to be discussed. There are still a lot of controversies and pros and cons that needs to be examined. However, these studies are not been disclosed yet. On the floor, we would like to discuss about the pros and cons. And at this point in time, there is no clear definition of what the active cyber defense is. The term has already been used in government entities outside Japan. However, these definitions may vary depending on the organization, so there's no solid definitions. But it is okay. It's okay that we will be defining these in more clear terms as we go on. Issues that I recognize is that there is a significant concern. In general terms, as we speak of these new ideas, there are many means and methods that will be considered as active traps. So it's often the case that we make mistakes as to who's going to take charge of it. As you know, this is only the policy that the government has set out at the high level, and each local government, as well as the self-defense forces and business entities, would need to be involved as we discuss who will be taking what part. As we have those discussions, how we are going to leverage this opportunity and when we are going to do this is going to be missed. And especially, this is something that's going to be relevant to you. The incident analysis is being done on the floor, and there's going to be operations, and we have to avoid that there's a conflict between those ones who are stipulating these policies and also working on the floor. How we are going to plan the counterattacks is very important. As the ground rule says, it is very important to do the profiling, as the analysts say. Profiling, as you probably know, is often the term that's used in the criminal profiling, in the criminal investigations, but we would like to use this in the terms of grouping. It's more virtual than attribution. And also, attack methodologies and attack vectors and trends will be judged based on the profiling. So that's the term that we would like to be using today. As we do the analysis, JP CERT Coordination Center did a blog posting last year. Active cyber defense is the term that came to be used. However, there's no consistent terms. As to the background of how this has come, the proactive cyber defense is the timeline and the phase that has never been considered before. Not just the active operations or offensive operations, different means and methods will need to be combined. The terms have evolved over time. Active cyber defense, offensive operation, hackback, there are different terms that's been used, and in the blog, we've kind of sorted out these definitions. Based on the hypothesis, we've examined why these different terms have been used from time to time, and depending on the context, we refer to different information, and these terms got mixed up. When there's a new concept or keywords, people who are part of it would like to use those terms actively. So, for instance, the term active defense is the term that's been used by the US military. And in this case, active includes the context of being proactive and positive to give a positive impression. And in the cybersecurity terms, in the 2010s, US military and intelligence industry had a lot of the knowledge exchanges, and different terms have been imported from different industry verticals. Active defense, kill chain, threat intelligence. These are the terms that were imported from the different industry verticals, and the information in the cybersecurity industry has been enriched. On the blog, again, I've mentioned that there are different options for proactive countermeasures. In taking the proactive operations, this could consist some hard and also disclosing the reports and disseminating information. On the soft side, this is very effective. Having said that, active cyber defense and offensive operations are just a part of a lot of the offensive operations. Active cyber defense will be explored going forward, as we are seeing that the term is not so stabilized. People may fear this new term and may set some expectations that whether this active cyber defense is going to allow us to challenge the fields that we have not tried. Things that we are not able to address may be able to be tackled, and because of that, we should consider this active cyber defense in a very positive manner. On the other hand, whether the active cyber defense is really contextual, that's a big question. Whether this is something that individual cases is being talked about, or whether this is something that as a country as a whole we should be tackling, or whether this active cyber defense is about whether we should be responsible for before the attack or after the attack. Scale, timeline, what are the focus that we need to be putting on? And as the objective of the offense, should we be stopping the offense or interrupting the offense in a tentative manner? Will these attacks continue for a long time? I know this is very complicated and obscure, but I would like to, again, try to clarify the definition of this a little bit more. Based on the scope that I have done the investigation in 2011, the National Defense has set out the policy of active cyber defense to defend the country. Initially, on each organization, this active cyber defense has been assumed so that this is a proactive response to attacks. On the left, you can see the original concept. Threat intelligence and other intelligence from outside will be used, and from time to time the tools were automated, and attacks have been responded, and the detection had been done. On the other hand, as I have mentioned, this program has started to evolve from just an organization to field, region, and a country. The same concept can be applied to a more wider range, and this is the trend that we've been seeing for some years.
On the other hand, by industry, by field, or by region, as the scale becomes bigger, the alignment between organizations will become more difficult. In particular, the attacks received by organization are different at different timings. Whether everyone will be responsive or aligned to take countermeasures against attack will be very difficult. And active cyber defense, this is a concept for one organization, but if you want to expand or scale it out, it is very difficult to begin with. And the word, how the word originated, there's some vagueness, and maybe that is the origin of ambiguity. And the active defense, as you might know, at the Cold War, the American military, the doctrine, that was a fight doctrine, and in Europe as well as the Warsaw and Soviet and NATO battle to the Warsaw, how can America take actions, and the resource team was concentrated and to defend. And originally the operational art, this was called operational art. This is one of the methodology, and the operational art, and this is the art for the campaign. And by operation, how to win the battle. This is one of the methodologies to win. And the left-hand side diagram is rather abstract, but there is a strategy and tactics. And in between, the tactics is how to fight in the battle by battle, and the strategy is countrywide or organization wide, how to achieve the goal. That is a planning. And in between, there are multiple wars or battles and operations, and in some time frame, how can the military fight. And this is what we call the art, the operational art. And active defense connects the strategy and tactics, and which was originated from the the U.S. military. But active defense, there is a typo, but it started from the operational art. But this is almost like a tactics. And so in the U.S. military, as well as in the U.S., there was a criticism, and gradually within the U.S. military, it was improved to escalated to operational art, and there was an airline battle in the Gulf War. And the active defense originally came from the military, and active defense may be used for the active cyber defense, maybe not, or maybe not. But we expect that they have something to do with it partially. And it started from the tactics, and then it evolved to operational art. And active cyber defense at a glance may look like a tactics concept, but to scale it to the operational art. So there needs to be some the action to fix it or to modify it. And some of the points to think about the definition, and there's some research about campaigns, and we'd like to get some insights from the specialists. And this was published from last year as a cyber persistence theory. And in this book, over 10 years or 15 years in the America, there's some proactive operation evaluation and analysis taking place. And the author concluded that existing countermeasures for deterrence, such as public activation and the deterrence theory for the existing security and cyber countermeasures based on deterrent theory, was not very effective or failing. And that's most of the cyber attacks are forced coaction. So it's not the force for the security, but rather the operation, such as to make a de facto, to take information, or to steal money, or to damage. So they're doing a lot of not a coaction, but it's most of exploitation to accumulate de facto exploitation. And in case of theory, of the deterrence, who are you going to act on? The policy makers, such as the government, or to the ministry, and to affect the government. But in case of cyber, rather it's campaign by campaign, and to take some actions against campaign. And the book says that direct cyber behavior or direct cyber engagement. This is a translation that I made up, and so they're taking actions by campaign to have the total advantage. This may sound very abstractive, but this is a kind of theory which is introduced in the book anyway. The point is like the deterrence theory to the policy maker of the country, but rather in the short term, it's operation by operation. So that need to take actions quickly, and this is rather busy. But anyway, keep taking actions every day according to this concept. The active cyber defense doctrine is something that we should focus on campaign and by tactics rather than by case, for instance, to do the takedown or to do the communication filtering, or maybe there are pros and cons, but to do the hackback, there are some individual countermeasures. And these are the tactics, so between tactics and strategies, their operation or operation campaign, what sort of actions to take by operation. That is what is needed for doctrine. And this is very abstract, so I'd like to talk more about the specifics. The definition of the doctrine can be thought into different ways, the timing and costs. First, timing. With the active cyber defense, if there is any specific operation to the enemy's measure, and if to prevent damage, and how can the party prevent the damage at what timing. And APT attacks, as you know, will be very hard to capture the APT attacks area, and the victim may find something and then will ask the specialists like us or to analysts like you and take actions afterward. And to begin with, the victim, you need the information from the victim. And if you have received unauthorized access, but in some case during the attack, maybe it is detected halfway. That happens quite often. And the final goal of the attacker may be the theft of information. So they haven't stolen the information, but they have already made an intrusion. So the unauthorized access has already taken place, but the final goal of the attacker is not achieved yet. Say you want to prevent the damage, and if you want to prevent the theft of information, then certainly the unauthorized access take place, but you prevented the final damage. On the other hand, the other point is the attacker to impose cost on attackers. This is an important concept that I'd like to elaborate in the next slide. To impose cost on attackers, what does it mean? There's no theoretical definition either. The Western government use a term such as cyber attacks and to impose cost on attackers. This is a word that the governments refer to quite often and individually. This is almost like a payback. In the film, I thought they were using this word so that it sounds good, but if I read it in carefully, this has some double meanings. And first, for the security, this is a deterrence by punishing the enemy. That is what I meant by payback. So the cost, so that they need to pay back, and after the attack, take countermeasure and to stop the subsequent attack.
The other is the denial, deterrence denial. In order for the attackers to attack, it requires a lot of cost on the attacker's side to pay, so that it will become a deterrence. As the Japanese government is trying to revise the 3 basic documents on security, these are the points that have been discussed a lot. Imposing cost on the attackers needs thinking. On this slide, vertically you see the cost, accumulated cost, and the time on the horizontal axis. Assuming the APT attacks, the attackers, of course, cannot be consisted of one or two people. It requires multiple team or huge teams. It requires huge human investment. And in the APT, using the legitimate tools have been very popular nowadays. However, in order for them to achieve critical goals, they need to develop malwares on their own. It requires development cost, preparing infrastructure, targeting, identifying the targets, and doing the attacks. Require all cost. Not just paying for the servers, but also it requires some transaction cost and coordination costs as well. Having said that, right before the attack happens, when they gain access, that's probably the point in time when their cost for the preparation maximizes. This is only on my own opinion, but after the access is made, then they only require cost for the operation, whether it's going to be a cost for human capital or for the asset, but the curve is going to be much smoother. The preparation cost maximizes. At that point in time, the access is going to be made. That's probably when the attack is going to be made. And at this point in time, if we can deter or stop the attacks, then it will be a maximum amount of sunken cost on the attacker's side. Imposing cost is not just about the imposing damage, but it is also going to be increasing the amount of cost or sunken cost that the attackers would need to pay, and also the lost opportunity that's going to be significant. Also, as we speak of APTs, domain or servers that are going to be used are often identified by the analysts. If we identify them and if we can take them down immediately, what happens? Detecting them and taking them down on early stage, it sounds like an active cyber defense type of operation, but if you do this too early, then, or if we are going to take such an active cyber defense approach, then the attackers know that their servers have been taken down, so they will probably duplicate their environment and prepare another C2 server. So if we can take down early on, then all they need to do is to switch over to their backup. It may help to delay the expected date of the attack, but it will still make them alive. It's probably not so good to let them swim, but taking them down as early as possible is not necessarily a good idea. We should strike the right moment so that they are reaching the point of no return. But yet, the attack is not still on its full-fledged manner. This is going to be the main topic of today. We need to profile the attackers properly. At what timing, what approach, what methodologies would they be using need to be profiled appropriately, so that we can probably take the actions to deter their action or attempt of attacks. Individual tactics. There are different cyber defense approaches that are summarized here, but these are not the main topics that I would like to discuss today, so I would like to just rush through this part. On the slide 20, I have prepared some contents about the blocking of the communication. C2 server connections will need to be blocked, and filters will be used 2 years ago, according to the Ministry of Telecommunications. Telecom carriers have analyzed the flow information to identify the C2 servers, and you probably know this research. Assuming the APT, blocking the communication servers are effective to a certain extent. Examining other methodologies, we wanted to assess whether this is more effective. If we can identify during the preparation the infrastructure used for the attacks, then before the attack is going to take a full-fledged power, we can technically block their telecommunications. Of course, there are some business issues, but we can defend and block the connection. And also, the cost on the victim side will be minimized. When we can block the connection, when the attacker's cost is on the peak, then it's also possible. Counterattacks will have its limitations. Known attackers and known infrastructures would need to have sufficient information in order for us to block the connection. Botnet takedown connection, which are often seen outside Japan, requires some time of infrastructure availability, and because of that fact, we were able to collect a lot of information to block the attacks. Unknown infrastructure, unknown attackers will not be able to be blocked. And also, after blocking the connection, they may switch over to their backup C2 server. Also, the biggest issue is that this is going to be a rat race, meaning that the telecom companies would need to pay more, and because the attackers will be switching over the infrastructure, so the telecom companies will need to be paying for that cost, and there will be no ceiling for that, and that's going to be the biggest concern. Flow information is limited to capture the attack communication, so we need to be capturing more information. Attackers' infrastructure observed on the victim sites, as well as the trend and tendencies of the attackers' groups, would need to be understood. We are not capable of blocking the attacker's infrastructure if the infrastructure is unknown. Whether the attacker is taking redundancy or what sort of technologies they are using or what sorts of infrastructure they are using would need to be available in order for the defenders to do the profiling properly. Next is a public attribution. This is more of this, not just the strategic, but this is more of a midterm strategy. The public attribution has audience, but we need to ask who the audience are. Are these attackers? Are these background entities? Is there any signaling? Are these done for alerts? Or are these done for the appeal for relations with allies? Or whether there's any appeal to the international communities? Are these messages about the attackers and illegal acts of those countries? We need to be consistent. As we do the public attribution, there is a big question about its efficacy. As for the counterattacks, the public attribution is often used as a leading example. However, there is a lot of the attacks that are tolerant to public attribution.
For instance, APT28 or Sand1 group, the active measures, they are doing a lot of cyber operations as active measures. In case of active measures, the people who execute may be Russia, and if the Russia is a state in the background, that may become the effectiveness of the attack. And if I start talking about this, we will run out of time. So please make a reference to other publications. The public attributions, they are likely to be the state. And then if it is announced, this may be the impact of the attack. So it's not that the public attribution is not helpful, but rather this is a complicated cyber attack. And also the Also there are a lot of public attribution for the encrypted assets, and the North Korea is in the state in the background, and they are trying to evade from the sanctions, and this has already been covered in the media. And so, in other words, with the cyber, that North Korea is going to be blamed, but the North Korea doesn't care. But they are not going to at least not change their act. And also, it says the active cross-border access, and it's for the offensive access. There are different ways of access, such as unauthorized access or to attack the vulnerability. The access itself, who does the access? So by organization who execute this may change the characteristics. And this is not the main topic of the day to talk about the offensive attack, so I'm not going to cover this. But if it's a military organization, then as a military activity, maybe it is considered as taking military action. And if it's the private, such as analysts, then according to the international law, it may not be considered as taking military action. But if you have a cross-border access, and if overseas server, if you're looking at the attacker C2 server, but maybe you had some mistake about the operation and the server provider, or maybe customers are affected because they're involved, then that is considered as a problem for international law, and therefore need to pay the damage. But that is considered an issue between private and private organization. However, taking the military actions or if it is an international problem, it won't be such a controversial international problem. But even if it was done by the private organization, if it is attributable to the state, then the state's responsibility will be at stake. So there are some lawyers who already researching this from the international law. We need to analyze in detail. So who does this will change the characteristics and will be determined differently in the international society. I'd like to jump to page 25. And this active access or the countermeasure may be drawing a lot of attentions, and the countermeasure, for instance, if there is any development of the international law, there are two main operational issues. One is on the left, the time limitation, and the countermeasure destination cannot be found to be more effective with the unauthorized access. And if the attacks taken place, maybe the time elapsed before coming to the private sector like us or by the police. And if you are taking incident countermeasure, and when you start incident research, the C2 server has already become inactive. In many cases, for instance, the countermeasure destination cannot be discovered. That is a problem. And if it's not a general unauthorized access, if it was a large-scale server attack, it would be even more complicated. The system service interruption takes place, and so we need to prioritize actions against that. So C2 server information to get information from the victim will be even more challenging. You won't be able to find the destination. You cannot find the active C2 server, which is alive, and also the countermeasure attack infrastructure, the destination, or the private hosting provider overseas that is on the server run by the overseas server. So there may be some ripple effect, and maybe consider the countermeasure destination by mistake and may affect the legitimate victim. And maybe this is not the discussion yet. And from the profiling point of view, the attacker, the characteristics must be considered. If the countermeasures is taken, we cannot accept it. I don't think many attackers will accept it. Maybe there's some hiding the evidence, or maybe to block investigation. And so attacker, what sort of characteristics or what sort of skills do they have? in advance. With high accuracy, we must understand what sort of capability the attackers have. Otherwise, the countermeasures won't be very effective. And I'd like to summarize the importance of profiling. To begin with, when I say profiling, the threat actor, who is the threat actor? Before profiling, the threat itself may have to be understood, but maybe there's no right understanding. So on the right, there are the goals and also the actors, espionage or to the military actions or the theft. And however, there are some laws and policies in country, and the cyber attack may be one term, although the attacks may vary. And from the policy point of view, the security policies in the important infrastructure or the government agencies, and maybe it is considered by agency or military by military. And if it's cyber attack, it is not the policy created by the types of attacks. So the threat classification is not done appropriately in country. And why is it a problem? For instance, as mentioned, as an active measure, if the cyber attack takes place, to do the public attribution may be not very effective, or rather may have some negative effect. And other ways, such as the third from the bottom, to the cyber operation as intelligence. And what do? They are doing the intelligence activity. So depending on the types of the attack, the activity being exposed may be something that attackers will consider as a damage for them. Then the public attribution or to alert is something that may be appropriate. And the covert action, I am not going to cover this today, but some countries might say it must be hidden as assumption that the states did this attack. And this, if this attack is exposed or if it is going to be public attribution and which states are involved to make it public, will be a huge damage for attackers. Likewise, who the actor is, and by the purpose of operations, the countermeasures that should be taken against attackers are different, but we haven't started discussion anyway. The purpose or the actor or the tendencies or characteristics must be profiled first. And from the prior cases in the West, in the US, mainly, some of the operations that might be helpful exist. And page 32, you may still have a fresh memory. In October 2022, there was a checkbot countermeasure, Microsoft domain procedure, and also the US Cyber Command operations perhaps took place. And publicly, they did not announce it, so this is just the guess.
After these actions have been taken, the trickbot has been available for some time. The takedown was assumed that it had failed. The cyber team, US Cyber Command's operation were very unique. And this cyber command activities were too much. And right after this incident had happened, I also had the same opinion. So when I got the inquiry, I responded that way. But Microsoft on that blog at that time posted that in November 2020, in the US presidential election, there was a huge cyber operation against ransomware. Considering the initial access, the trickbot infrastructure could have been misused or abused, so they wanted to suspend it even for time being. So on a tentative way, the trickbot utilization has been lowered, and that was probably one of the offensive operations on the Microsoft side, and we can see some certain benefits out of it. There are still some challenges that need to be considered. This is not the main topic of what I wanted to talk, so I will go through this very quickly. I've explained the different operations, but can you get the information on the edge is very important. Regardless of who you are, providing the information from the victim organization is very important but sensitive at the same time. Finding a lot of malware samples is very important. Getting information from the victim organization is key because we all depend on it. As we consider the active cyber defense going forward, the involved players and government entities will, of course, will run to the victim organizations asking and begging for the information. But this is something that we want to avoid. We have to find ways to collect information from other sources, not just from the victim organization. Who's going to make decisions about the active cyber defense is also another challenge. I'm just going to go through this quickly. Stipulating the strategies or the policy planners should not be involved in detailed tactical decision makings on the field. We should empower the people on the field so that they can make decisions in a very dynamic and flexible, agile manner. In order for them to be agile, they need to be able to make decisions on their own. Sorry, I'm going over my time, but I want to go through this slide. We also need to consider the impact of professional organizations and analysts. Considering the relationship to the previous activities, we also, of course, need to be mindful of how we can respond to retaliation or interference from attackers. And also, we may be tracked back. We have to consider how to accept the APT groups who will be less traceable after the disruptive operation. Newly required roles is that through those responses to the issues of what we will do to the evaluation after the positive operation has been taken place. And also the role of analysts in the external evaluations other than active operation performance. The public sector analysts and other analysts who are involved in the threat intelligence would need to pay very close attention to this. Also, the roles as one of the parties involved in the constantly evaluating the ethics of the countermeasures would need to be taken into consideration. I run over my time, so I would like you to just read this summary on your own. Before I close, however, I know I'm going over my time. Mr. Sugio Takahashi has published this book of the strategy theory of the contemporary world. In this book, he mentioned that he referred to the words from the Dwight D. Eisenhower, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. Also, when formulating strategic documents, it is often the case that the participants are limited to the standpoint of preserving confidentiality. From this perspective, we have been considering that only the involved decision makers will be able to have access to the policy draft, but this is not necessarily the case. If the subordinate organizations make up the organization do not have this sense of ownership, they will not have the sense that the strategy documents prepared by the limited number of people are their own strategy. The example of a higher level strategy being shared as the tactic knowledge is that the policy containment of the US during the Cold War was not defined as an official strategy document. Although Kennan's long telegram and X article existed, this was only the shared understanding. However, this containment was the policy that was applied during the Cold War. As I have mentioned at the beginning, I am too humbled to make a presentation here in front of you, but as we are going to be discussing about active cyber defense going forward, I hope that my presentation have given you some food of thoughts. This is something that everyone who are here would need to be involved as we plan for the future. There will be a lot of controversies and dialogues that will be required to take place. However, this is something that we need to be mindful of all the different levels of organizations and entities. Thank you for your time. Sorry for exceeding my time.